I'm usually not the type to get spooked. I grew up with horror movies, ghost stories, and all the usual Halloween thrills. But last year, on Halloween night, something happened that I still can't fully explain. It wasn't just creepy, it was something a lot darker, something that left me questioning what's real. I live in a small town in northern Maine. It's the kind of place that almost feels stuck in time, with old colonial-style houses, dense woods, and a general air of mystery, especially in autumn. That Halloween night, I was alone in the house. My roommate Jordan was out of town, and since it was a weeknight, most people weren't throwing big parties. So, I decided I'd just settle in with some snacks, a horror movie, and a few drinks. It was around 11:30 when I decided to call it a night. I remember pausing to lock the front door before heading to bed, and for some reason, I glanced out the small window by the door. That's when I noticed a figure standing just outside the gate to my yard. My heart jumped a bit, but I tried to brush it off. After all, it was Halloween. People walk around in costumes, right? But something about the figure was wrong. I couldn't make out any clear details, just the silhouette. He stood completely still, almost statue-like. What unsettled me the most was the face, or rather, the lack of it. The porch light cast just enough glow that I could tell it wasn't a mask. It looked like a blank, pale face, no eyes, no mouth, just skin stretched over where features should have been. I kept staring, wondering if maybe I was just seeing things. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the figure tilted its head slightly, in a way that almost seemed curious. Chills ran down my spine. For a few minutes, I just stood there, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move closer, didn't try to come to the door, just stayed there, tilting its head like it was watching me watch it. I decided I'd had enough, so I pulled the curtain over the window and tried to shake it off as some bizarre Halloween prank. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and got into bed, telling myself it was just some weirdo playing around. I put on a podcast to distract myself, but my mind kept drifting back to that figure. I kept replaying the image in my head, that faceless face staring back at me. I must have dozed off, but sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up with a start. My room was dark, but I felt wrong. There was a sense of heaviness in the air, like something was pressing down on me. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear. But the sound continued, like someone dragging their feet just outside my door. My heart was pounding so fast. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or something equally harmless, but every instinct in me was screaming that there was something, someone, just outside. I debated calling out, maybe asking, "Who's there?" But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed, listening to the slow shuffling steps that seemed to be inching closer to my door. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I don't know how long I lay there, too afraid to move. Then, in the silence, I heard a faint scratching sound. It was subtle, like someone lightly scraping their nails along the door, testing it. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I felt an overwhelming sense of horror. The scratching moved from the center of the door to the sides, like whatever was out there was feeling along the edges, searching for a way in. I don't know what possessed me, but I finally managed to sit up and grab my phone. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the door. The scratching stopped instantly, and the silence was suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to get out of bed and approach the door. I held my ear to the wood, listening for any hint of sound, but all was still. After a few moments, I slowly unlocked the door and eased it open, shining my phone's flashlight into the dark hallway. It was empty. Feeling a mix of relief and confusion, I stepped out and checked the rest of the house. The front door was still locked, and all the windows were closed. There was no sign of anyone having broken in. No footprints or anything unusual. But as I stood there in the quiet, I had this nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to check outside, just to be sure. I turned on the porch light and cautiously opened the door. There, right on the front step, was a faint, muddy outline of a handprint. It looked too small to belong to an adult, almost like a child's, but it was smudged, the fingers elongated and twisted in a way that didn't seem natural. At this point, I didn't want to stay in the house any longer. I grabbed my keys and got into my car, driving around town until dawn. When I finally returned, exhausted and unnerved, there was no sign of the handprint. I checked the door, the windows, nothing was out of place. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I know it did. I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. I even tried telling my roommate about it when he got back, but he just laughed it off, saying, it was a Halloween prank or my mind playing tricks. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Since then, Halloween has never felt the same to me. There's this part of me that wonders if whatever I saw that night will come back, if it's out in the yard somewhere. I had recently moved to Boston for work, and I didn't know many people in the area. My girlfriend Claire had planned to come up from New York to spend the weekend with me, but her trip got canceled last minute. So, there I was dressed as a detective, walking the streets alone, figuring I'd go to a bar, meet some people, and call it a night. In a crowded city, even a lone night on Halloween didn't feel unsafe to me. After a couple of hours at a bar near Beacon Hill, I decided to walk home. I wasn't very far from my apartment in the Back Bay area, so it seemed like an easy walk. By this time, it was around 1:30 a.m., and the streets were finally starting to thin out. I remember thinking the cool October air was finally getting to me, and I pulled my coat a little tighter. As I turned onto a narrow side street to cut across to my place, I noticed a person at the other end of the block. It wasn't unusual to see people out that night, of course, but that person caught my eye because he was standing straight, staring in my direction. He was wearing a bright red raincoat with the hood up, which I thought was odd, considering it hadn't rained all day. But I told myself it was Halloween. People were trying to look creepy on purpose. I'd seen plenty of people dressed as clowns, zombies, even a few vampires trying to unsettle strangers. But as I got closer, something about the man in the red raincoat felt off. His face was mostly hidden under the hood. When he moved his head a little up, I saw his strange eyes. Even from a distance, I could tell they were unusually bright, reflecting light in a way that didn't seem natural, almost like the eyes of an animal caught in headlights. He was staring directly at me, unblinking. I quickened my pace, trying to act casual, telling myself he was just some Halloween prankster. But I started to feel that there is something seriously wrong with him. When I was about 20 feet away, he suddenly raised his hand in a slow wave. I stopped, feeling my heartbeat as I stared back at him. His wave was unsettlingly slow, like each movement took an effort that a normal person wouldn't have to put in. And his eyes, they didn't leave mine. I thought about turning around and finding another way home, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Then, just as I began to walk again, he took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away. The man in the red raincoat stopped, tilting his head in a way that reminded me of a curious animal. He didn't blink, didn't smile, just stared at me with those unnatural, shining eyes. Finally, I mustered the nerve to speak up. "Hey man, is everything okay?" He didn't respond. He just tilted his head a bit further, his eyes fixed on me. Then, without warning, he started to walk toward me slowly. I backed up faster, realizing that this wasn't some drunk guy or a Halloween joke. This was something different, something that felt wrong, on a level I can't quite explain. My instincts kicked in, and I turned and started walking faster in the opposite direction. I could hear his footsteps behind me. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his presence, feel him gaining on me. I crossed over onto a busier street, hoping to see someone, anyone who might give me a reason to shake this weird fear that was flooding over me. But there wasn't any person in sight. I kept walking, practically jogging now, and finally reached the edge of my street. I thought if I could just get home, close the door, I'd be safe. But as I turned the corner, I felt a heavy weight on my shoulder. A hand. His hand had grabbed me. I spun around to face him, and this time, I could see his face clearly. His skin was pale, almost grayish, and his eyes were completely white, no pupils, no color, just blank, staring orbs. His mouth twisted into a strange smile, but it was all wrong, as if he was forcing himself to imitate human expressions. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice soft and strange. "It's so late. Shouldn't you be inside?" I yanked my shoulder out of his grasp and took off running. My mind was racing, but all I knew was I had to get away from him. I sprinted the last few blocks to my building, practically throwing myself through the lobby doors and slamming them shut behind me. I turned around, expecting to see him right outside the glass, but he was gone. I stood there with a breath of calm, feeling the intense relief wash over me. But as I turned to head up to my apartment, I froze again. Standing at the end of the lobby hallway near the elevators was the man in the red raincoat. He must have followed me through a different entrance, but there was no way he could have made it here so quickly. It was as if he had simply appeared there. I backed up against the lobby doors, watching as he slowly raised his hand in that same unsettling wave. My whole body was paralyzed with fear. and I couldn't look away. I thought about yelling, calling for help, but the weight of fear was so heavy on my tongue that I was not even able to speak at that moment. I stood there, shaking, until I finally forced myself to move, sprinting up the stairs to my apartment. I locked the door, turned on every light, and sat on my bed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I checked the security footage just to make sure I hadn't imagined or hallucinated it all, but there was nothing. No sign of a man in a red raincoat anywhere in the building. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. Sometimes, when I walk alone at night, I swear I can feel those blank, white eyes watching me. And every Halloween since, I've stayed in, locked my doors, and avoided the streets. It started out as a normal Halloween plan. My friends and I decided to camp out at Gorman Woods, a popular spot near our hometown. It was one of those forest preserves with hiking trails, big trees, and a few secluded spots where we could sit around a fire. The group was the usual crew: Brian, Jenna, Nate, Haley, and me. We'd all known each other since high school, so this was more like an excuse to get together, laugh, and tell a few ghost stories under the stars. We got there late in the afternoon, set up our tents, and got a fire going as it got dark. It was the perfect Halloween setting, honestly. The cool October air, a full moon, and that eerie silence that settles in the woods after sunset. We spent a few hours swapping stories and roasting marshmallows, but as the night went on, something changed. There was a quiet, really heavy silence where you couldn't even hear crickets. I remember looking at Haley and seeing she was tense too. She kind of laughed and said, "Does it feel weird to anyone else?" That was when Jenna suggested we go for a short hike to shake it off. None of us were really into the idea of wandering through dark woods on Halloween, but we didn't want to seem like we were scared. So we grabbed our flashlights and followed her down one of the trails. It was probably around 11 p.m. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees. I kept telling myself it was just the Halloween vibe. We were creeping each other out, that's all. But it felt different from the usual scares, like the woods were watching us. Every sound made me a bit scared, and it didn't help that no one was talking. We were just moving through the trees in this dead silence. Then, out of nowhere, Nate stopped in his tracks. "Look," he whispered, pointing ahead through the trees. At first, I didn't see it, but then I caught a faint light off in the distance. It looked like an old lantern, one of those vintage kinds, glowing with a warm orange light that stood out against the dark. We all stopped and stared. I remember feeling that uneasy excitement, like we were in some horror movie scene that could turn bad at any moment. Brian mumbled, "It's gotta be a ranger, right? Or another camper?" We debated for a few seconds whether to go check it out or turn back. But before I could even think about it, we were all moving toward the light, curiosity getting the best of us. As we got closer, the light started to sway gently, almost like someone was holding it and swinging it back and forth. I could barely make out the figure. It looked like a person, standing with the lantern held out in front of them. The weirdest part was that we couldn't hear a thing, no footsteps, no rustling. Just that light, floating there, dead silent. We got a little closer, not too much, and I got a better look at the figure. It was a man, maybe older, with his head down, so I couldn't see his face. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat, and everything about him looked out of place, like he was from another time. I felt a chill, and I could tell the others felt it too. Jenna whispered, This doesn't feel right," but none of us could take our eyes off him. That's when the man lifted his head and looked straight at us. My stomach dropped. His face was almost grayish, but the worst part was his hollow eyes, like two empty sockets staring right at us. I froze, completely paralyzed. He didn't move. He just stared, his face locked in an unnatural expression. Finally, Nate broke the silence, saying, "Let's go." He didn't shout or scream. He just turned and walked quickly back toward the campsite, and we all followed, trying to keep calm but desperate to get away. My hands were shaking as I gripped my flashlight, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him coming after us. When we made it back to the campsite, we didn't say a word. We just sat around the fire, barely breathing. I was certain we'd see that lantern coming through the trees at any second. Every crack of a twig or snap of a leaf made me scared, but the man never came. We stayed up all night, unable to shake that image of his hollow eyes, that cold, empty stare. By morning, we packed up in record time, none of us wanting to stay in those woods a second longer. The drive home was quiet. We tried to laugh it off, say it was just a Halloween scare, but I think we all knew better. Since then, I haven't been back to Gorman Woods. I don't even like to think about it. That's all for today, guys. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.